Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our combined surgery and anesthesia rounds. We do this every year, and usually anesthesia hosts around Ether Day, which was on October 16th this year. My name is Mallory Garza. For those who don't know me, I'm currently the medical director for continuing professional development for the Department of Anesthesia. And welcome to our Ether Day. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Mike Wong today for his talk. I just wanted to let you know that I'll also be moderating questions. So if you'd like to type anything in the chat box, I'll keep an eye there. You can also raise your hand at the end of the talk if you have any questions and would like to speak up, but we'd ask that you save your questions for the end of the talk. For those who don't know Dr. Mike Wong, he's back by popular demand. He graduated from Dow Anesthesia in 2020 after doing medical school here and finishing in 2014. In 2021, he just recently completed his obstetrical anesthesia fellowship at the University of Maryland at the Shock Trauma Hospital. He's currently at Western University completing a second fellowship in chronic pain, and he is due to finish around Christmas time, after which he'll do some locums and then join his family in St. John and the department in St. John here in the Maritimes. He's on many relevant committees for this talk, including the American Association for History of Medicine. It's a bit of an interest for him, and we're really happy to have him here. Thanks for coming, Dr. Wong.
Great. I think I'm unmuted right now. So thank you for the very gracious introduction there, Dr. Garza. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be speaking with everybody here today and to present today's very special combined surgery anesthesia Ether Day Grand Rounds. My only regret is not being there in person to catch up, but soon enough, things will change. All right, so I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. And so first, I acknowledge that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And today I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario, which is in the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookaton peoples. So the Indigenous nations are the original caretakers of this land, and they have been subject to historic and ongoing injustices. It is imperative for us to renew respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, advocacy, and our community service. And a couple of disclaimers here before I begin. First, I have no financial conflicts of interest. Secondly, I am not formally trained as a historian or an archivist. I'm mostly someone who's interested in old stories and collecting old things. And as Mallory mentioned, Ether Day, for those who are interested in semantics, was October 16th and not today. And October 16th is now celebrated as World Anesthesia Day. I have a couple of objectives for this presentation that I'll loosely follow, but it all can be summarized into really two succinct questions. And the first of it, which deals with discoveries in anesthesia in the early days, and what role surgeons had to play in those. And the second question, which is equally, if not more interesting, is the question of who exactly is anesthesia. And so starting with the first question, what is anesthesia? As it turns out, surgeons have had quite an instrumental role to play in these developments. If we think back to contextualize first what life was like in the pre-anesthetic era, if we think about what a surgery might look like, images such as this come to mind. We're thinking about a patient who is held down to a chair or an operating table, writhing, screaming, and while the barber surgeon hastily does the deed. And if you think about scenes like this, there's really not much opportunity to encounter what you might call a quiet surgical field in any sense of that term. And the opportunities for delicate or sophisticated surgeries, it can be rare, few and far between. When you think about the patient experience in these circumstances, it's certainly different from what it is today. This was a popular English novelist, Frances Burney, who in the year 1811 was diagnosed with a breast tumor, ended up having to have a mastectomy. And so she writes about her surgery. When the dreadful steel was plunged into the breast, cutting through veins, arteries, flesh, nerves, I began a scream that lasted intermittingly during the whole time of the incision, and I almost marvel that it rings not in my ears still. I then felt the knife rattling against the breastbone, scraping it. This performed while yet I remained in utterly speechless torture. And so this was obviously an incredibly traumatic experience for her and many others during her time and before. And now that's not to say that in that time there were not sedatives or analgesics. Really, if we look back at the times of antiquity, from the Sumerians, Egyptians, Greeks, Chinese, indigenous peoples around the world, there were medicinal plants of all sorts. Things such as cannabis, opium, good old alcohol, as well as a mystical mandrake root could have some sedative qualities on their own. Additionally, various tribes in South America discovered that the coca leaf, when mashed up, could provide a weak local anesthetic effect. But really, from ancient times until the 19th century, there was not any revolutionary change in terms of these medications or things that could give greater deal of relief. Now, until we encounter a Japanese surgeon by the name of Hanaoka Seishu, lived from 1760 to 1835. His main interest was in tumors of the breast, much like what Fanny Burney had. And over many years of his career, he developed a specific mixture of medicinal plants that he called mafutsusen, which could be taken orally to induce in the patient a state of unconsciousness, insensitivity to pain, and provided a pretty reasonable muscle relaxation for him to do his work, which to me sounds a lot like general anesthesia. And his first breast surgery under this general anesthetic, if you will, was actually in 1804, and this was 7 years before Burney's horrifying experience. He performed over 150 surgeries using this anesthetic. He taught students, but unfortunately for him, Imperial Japan at the time was a famously insular society and had little contact with the outside world. Therefore, his discoveries were largely unheard of outside of Japan. And today, I'm not presenting the Mafutsusen Day grand rounds. It's, of course, Ether Day. Now, the circumstances behind Ether Day are all incredibly interesting, and they date back a very long ways. You could talk about this for an hour and still not do justice to it, so I'm not even going to try. In this famous painting, we have the surgeon, John Collins Warren, performing a neck tumor excision at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Standing at the head of the bed, holding a glass apparatus, is the dentist, local dentist, local scoundrel, William Morton, administering ether to the patient. And this whole demonstration was done, at Morton's request. He had to really convince Warren to be involved in this, and Warren was ultimately, very skeptical about the prospects of this, mysterious medication for painless surgery. But by the end of the case, he really was won over, and supposedly, allegedly, he made the exclamation to the crowd at the end that, gentlemen, this is no humbug. And the rest, they say, is history from there. Now, there's really a whole host of other characters in the ether story. And Morton was certainly not the first to discover ether, nor was he the first to even use it for analgesia or for surgical anesthesia. But importantly, he was the one to attract a lot of attention to it and to get the world interested in it. And some of these people, he would end up squabbling till the end of his days over credit for the discovery of anesthesia. Now, this was 1846. It doesn't take long for word to reach Canada, the British Empire, and beyond. And so In 1847, we have the obstetrician James Simpson in Great Britain trying to use ether in labor analgesia. It works pretty well, but he's somewhat dissatisfied with how much it stinks, how slow it takes to kick in, and he decides that he can figure out a better anesthetic. And the way he does that is he invites some friends over to his house. They take a bunch of vials of other chemicals, so chloroform, iodoform, acetone, nitric ether, and they sit there and huff these chemicals to see whether any of them had some favorable analgesic properties. Self-experimentation. So luckily for them, nobody dies, and it turns out that chloroform is actually, pretty darn good as an anesthetic in that sense. It works a lot faster as an anesthetic than ether. It smells a lot better, and it seems to last a bit longer as well. So he introduces this to his obstetric practice. The first child that was delivered under chloroform actually ended up being named Anesthesia in recognition for this. And then word spreads. By 1853, the famous John Snow, physician, surgeon, father of public health and epidemiology, goes on to give chloroform to Queen Victoria after the birth of Prince Leopold. And she is quite enamored with its ability to produce painless childbirth. And that really puts chloroform on the map throughout the British Empire and their sphere of influence. Now, surgeons also had an important role to play in terms of regional anesthesia and local anesthesia. So cocaine, the active ingredient in the coca leaf, was isolated by German chemists starting in the early 19th century. It sat on a shelf for many years before people realized what to do with it. In 1884, the ophthalmologist Karl Kohler decides that cocaine was an excellent medication to use for eye surgery, just as a local anesthetic. He presents his findings, and in the same year, two New York surgeons, Richard Hall and William Halsted, then decide to experiment with cocaine, first with infiltration of cocaine into wounds, which helped a lot with pain control. And they also did some peripheral nerve blockade of lower upper extremity, brachial plexus, head and neck terminal branches with excellent effect. So they realized that cocaine was not only a hell of a drug for ophthalmology, but really could be used anywhere in the body. And they too engaged in self-experimentation with Halsted becoming severely addicted to cocaine, only to be cured by replacing his addiction with one to heroin and morphine instead. That didn't stop him from becoming the first chief of surgery at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And of course, this history would not be complete without talking about the German surgeon, August Beer. He was not the first individual to perform a lumbar puncture, nor was he the first one to inject things into the intrathecal space. But in 1898, he was the first to perform and popularize the injection of cocaine, cocainization of the spinal cord for the purpose of surgery. He was very impressed with how dense analgesia he could produce from it and how paralyzed the patients could be for the duration of action. Now, obviously, he also engaged in self-experimentation. But luckily for him, he got away with it with only a severe, post-dural puncture headache. And of course, he invents intravenous regional anesthesia, which still bears his name today. And I have one more early surgical anesthetic innovation to describe here, and that's, in spite of having a general anesthetic in an unconscious patient, you are not guaranteed a quiet surgical field, and involuntary movements would happen all the time. So the introduction of curare as the first neuromuscular blocking drug was an important development in doing more delicate or fine surgery. In 1912, the German surgeon Arthur Lowen was probably the first person to use it for surgical purposes. He found it was helpful for abdominal wound closure. And this guy also performed his own intubations and used it to help ventilate patients. Now, unfortunately for him, in 1912, both the quantity and quality of curare available was really quite unreliable. So he eventually gave up this practice. But over time, this medication derived from South American plants came to be better isolated, better synthesized. So that in 1942, there was a famous case series by Harold Griffith and his resident Enid Johnson out of McGill, describing the use of this in surgery. And of course, the rest, they say, is history. Now, just as a bit of a local connection, Enid Johnson was a native of New Brunswick. She was a graduate of Dow Med School. She struggled for many years to find work, to find postgraduate training, being a woman in surgery, until she met Dr. Griffith at a CMA meeting. And then they did this work. Now, eventually she returns to the Maritimes. She goes to Nova Scotia, and actually ended up teaching in the Department of Physiology here at Dow after giving up her anesthetic practice. And so she taught for many years and only retired in the 1980s. So that addresses much of the first question. Surgeons very early on, after the discovery of anesthesia, realized that it was very difficult to simultaneously give an anesthetic and to actually focus on doing a surgery. So then, somebody has to do the task of administering it. And obviously, it couldn't just be some guy off the street. So who could it be? Now, this is a tweet by our own John Bailey after a talk I gave earlier this year. First anesthetic in Newfoundland was given by some guy. But while the tweet itself is not entirely accurate, it does contain a grain of truth to it. And here's a very interesting article about the early days of anesthesia in Newfoundland. And while the very first general anesthetic in Newfoundland was certainly given by a physician, what this article does say was that in 1890, the first open abdominal surgery in Newfoundland, which was a C-section, a lady with tuberculosis of the spine. One Dr. Smith did it. Now, the anesthetic at this time was given by a local merchant. There was a customs officer who Smith had directed. And all of this was done on the patient's kitchen table. So the first open abdominal surgery anesthetic was given by some guy. It was a historic event in Newfoundland medical history. But obviously it's not ideal for just a random guy off the street to be giving anesthetic. Similarly, you could perform a C-section on a kitchen table or any other abdominal surgery, but that's just not the way we do things anymore. Now, this is a painting of the American Civil War, during which time tons of carnage, many injuries, lots of people requiring surgeries or other medical procedures. And during this event, plenty of some guys end up being put in the role of putting an ether-soaked rag on people's faces. The American Civil War was a time where nurses came to take on the role of giving anesthetics on a more frequent basis. And after the conclusion of the American Civil War, many surgeons continued to employ nurses for this role. More on them later. I just want to mention one more group of people that were, enlisted into giving anesthesia, and that's medical students and trainees. So here we have Harvey Cushing, father of neurosurgery, and he had his own very memorable experience with giving anesthetic as a medical student at Harvard. And so what he says is, I was called down from the seats and told to put the patient to sleep. I knew nothing about them whatsoever. I proceeded as best as I could under the orderly's directions. And at this time, he's getting calls from the auditorium to hurry up. There was a sudden great gush of fluid from the patient's mouth, most of which was inhaled, and he died. I stood aside, burning with chagrin and remorse. No one paid the slightest attention to me, although I supposed I had killed the patient. So this deeply traumatized him. And he would have to give more anesthetics as he progressed in medical school. But this event led him to work with some of his classmates to try to improve the safety of anesthesia out in Boston. And along with his classmate, Ernest Codman, he develops what is the world's first anesthetic record, recording the pulse and heart, the respiratory rate of the patient during the procedure. Now, if you look at today's anesthetic records, honestly, it's not all that much different. And so here we have another important fundamental advancement in anesthesia. And again, it's two surgeons to be that come up with this. So, while the discovery of anesthetic drugs was certainly revolutionary for surgeries and the scope of surgery, the act of giving an anesthetic was not held in particularly high esteem. And this former dean of Harvard Medical School had some not so kind words to say about the people that did. And this was only about a decade after Cushing had graduated from Harvard. So given sort of the low esteem that anesthetists were held in, it's not unreasonable to think that in those early days, if you had to think about it from a medical legal point of view, that the surgeon ruled the roost, and the relationship between them, if there was one, if there was a generalizable and universal, legal relationship between the surgeon and other people in the operating room, including the anesthetist, that it might be something on the basis of a master and servant relation. Now, there's one interesting legal case that happened where a patient sued after their arms were allowed to fall off the operating room table and dangle off the edge. One arm had a peripheral nerve injury and the other arm got burnt on a hot surface. Ultimately, the surgeon in that case was found to be liable. And as the judge had noted, once the doors of the operating room closed, the surgeon is supreme. Now, as gratifying as that statement might be to the ego, that case was quickly forgotten and really didn't influence anything. Really, the general trend during the early 20th century was really for surgeons to be recognized as having, perhaps, less responsibility over what other people were doing in the operating room, and certainly less vicarious responsibility for actions in the room. And initially, it was the case that surgeons would seek out a specific anesthetist to run their room on a given day, and they would be responsible for paying them. But over time, hospitals, departments of anesthesia ended up doing more of that administrative role, scheduling anesthetists, and also taking care of their remuneration. So in the end, a modern conception of the relationship was that there was no fixed relationship. It depended on a case-to-case basis. So although the 20th century starts with anesthesia being the lowest man on the totem pole, over time, things did change. Initially, it was the sort of thing where no one in their right mind really wanted to do anesthesia on a full-time basis, no physicians anyway. And it wasn't until the first decade of the 20th century that, in Canada, you started to have the odd full-time anesthesiologist. Hospital appointments were one early form of recognition. And then following that, in the early days, anesthesia tended to exist as divisions within departments of surgery or medicine or a department of therapeutics. And it wasn't until 1907 that Toronto General introduced its first, standalone department of anesthesia in the hospital. It later followed that university departments were developed. First in the University of Wisconsin with Ralph Waters in 1927. And then the first academic department of anesthesia came about in McGill in Canada. In the early days of anesthesia, discoveries were just reported in general medical journals, the Lancet, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, aka New England Journal of Medicine, and then shifted towards being represented in more dental and surgical journals. One milestone, though, as anesthesia research became more sophisticated and plentiful, was that the American Journal of Surgery started to publish a quarterly supplement in anesthesia and analgesia starting in 1914, which was then later spun off into its own journal, Current Researches in Anesthesia and Analgesia in 1922. This was the first anesthesia journal. In the early 20th century, you also start to have organization of anesthesia societies, such as the Canadian Society of Anesthetists in 1920, which was rather short-lived, but became the Canadian Anesthesiologists Society starting in 1943. And these were important because they were opportunities to present research, to network, and also perform advocacy for this type of work. And of course, here in Canada, we know how important the Royal College is. It was founded, with the recognition of the need to recognize physicians who are doing special work, quote unquote. The first fellowship examinations were introduced in 1931. Because not everybody wanted to bother doing them, a second tier certification status was introduced in 1937, though in neither case was anesthesia recognized as being its own thing. Not until 1942 was anesthesia allowed to have its own specialty certification status, not full fellowship. And really not until 1971 did a single anesthesia fellowship pathway become standardized, and anesthesia could be considered on equal footing with everybody else. Now, nurse anesthesia is a very topical thing these days. So I just wanted to loop back to this. I mentioned, that the American Civil War was something that got a lot of nurses interested in giving anesthesia, and this continued afterwards. After the Civil War, lots of informal training programs popped up, but by 1909 in Portland, Oregon, you get the first formal training school. World War I breaks out, and this has similar effect on manpower and ends up being a boon for nurse anesthesia. They come back from the war, they're more plentiful than ever before, and they start to get more organized as well. So that by 1931, you have the founding of the American Association for Nurse Anesthetists. And that's not just in the United States, they're actually pretty common in Canada as well. Now this is interesting. If you look at like really old newspapers and the social pages, it's very fascinating. It's kind of like somebody's Facebook feed just got blown up for the entire town or province to see. You can find out that Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so went on vacation, in this place, or you can find out whose kids are coming home from college to visit. It's really banal stuff. But out of this particular page, you can see with very little fanfare or fuss, two references to nurses who are being anesthetists at the Chipman Hospital in New Brunswick, one of whom is going down to take a course at what ends up becoming the Cleveland Clinic. And you see examples like this everywhere, and it's just something that happens and is very commonplace. Because again, you think about the nature of our country and how remote many places are. There simply were not enough medical people to perform this role in every community and every hospital. So ultimately, this was pretty common. And interestingly, in 1939, the one time in its history that the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists holds their annual meeting outside of the US was actually in Canada. It took place in Toronto, and they had about they had a couple of hundred, if not more than 1,000 delegates descend upon the city. They were here, they were organized, a lot more organized and plentiful than nurse anesthetists in Canada, for sure. And it was not for a lack of trying that nurse anesthesia did not become a lasting thing in this country. What did physicians think about it? Now, obviously, some were, at least to some degree, supportive of nurse anesthesia, especially those who had to, who were doing supervision of these nurse anesthetists in daily practice, or indeed trained them to do those roles. But obviously, some other people thought of anesthesia as being more of a medical practice instead, particularly as it got more sophisticated and complex. So you have this speech here from a physician leader in Houston, Texas. And here, this guy implores his colleagues to take anesthesia seriously, to think about doing research to advance the science of anesthesia, to think about things from a public relations point of view, to get medical students interested and excited in anesthesia, and for the love of God, to stop training people who would be their direct competitors. And in the United States and in Canada, physician groups did lobby to have anesthesia become a regulated medical practice. And here you have Edmund Lunny. He was a very prominent New Brunswick physician, also future president of the Canadian Anesthesiologist Society in the 50s, doing some such lobbying here in that country, or in that province. Now, what did surgeons think about it? Well, there were some very famous proponents of nurse anesthesia. This is Charles Mayo, co-founder of the Mayo Clinic. He had a personal nurse anesthetist by the name of Alice McGaw, who performed over 15,000 ether general anesthetics for him, very skilled in her own right. He called her the mother of anesthesia. You have George Washington Cryle. He was a very prominent Cleveland surgeon, did a lot of work around direct blood transfusion, became a co-founder of the Cleveland Clinic. His personal anesthetist, Agatha Hodgins, was actually the founding member of the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists. You have Arthur Blaylock of the Blue Baby fame at Johns Hopkins. Olive Louise Berger was his preferred anesthetist, and she did many of his surgeries with cyanotic heart disease. So, the very fragile kids and complex surgeries. And of course, Blaylock's immortalized to this day with the Blaylock-Thompson-Taussig, or BTT shunt for the cyanotic heart disease. And closer to home, you have Dr. Bernd Toast himself, Walter Penfield, who employed nurse anesthetists at the Montreal Neuro, and was a very vocal proponent of nurse anesthesia during the 1930s. And there probably were some surgeons opposed to nurse anesthesia and thought about it as a medical practice. They were not quite as vocal as some of these prominent names, but at the end of the day, most people were probably ambivalent about it, as long as they could just get their cases done and treat their patients. In the United States, there were a number of direct legal challenges in the teens and 20s about regulating anesthesia practice. Unfortunately, at this point, the horse had already left the barn. Nurse anesthesia had already happened for decades, and many hospitals were dependent on nurse anesthesia. So all of these cases were thrown out. In New York State, California, Kentucky, they never really went anywhere. In Canada, there were no high-profile legal cases of this nature, but nurse anesthesia did go away. And that's mostly due to policy and regulation considerations. So there is one case to really think about, and that's the case of the widow Ducharme versus the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, as well as the surgeon, Dr. Turner. So her husband, by the last name McFall, was a guy who unfortunately suffered a fall and had a tibial plateau fracture. Presents to the hospital, obviously needs to get it fixed. He didn't really take good care of himself. He was an alcoholic. He had a bit of a cough when he presented. So yeah, Dr. Turner was kind of concerned about him, consults the chief of anesthesia, a physician. They watch him for a couple of days, and yeah, he's pretty stable. So the chief of anesthesia assigns a nurse to take care of him during his surgery. He has an uneventful induction with nitrous oxide and oxygen. The surgery happens, fairly uneventfully. And it's towards the end of the case. They've closed the wound. They're putting the dressing and cast on, and he's not yet, emerged from anesthesia, when all of a sudden he has a cardiac arrest. And despite, all of their best efforts using, 1930s methods, the patient's unrevivable. The wife sues, and ultimately the case doesn't really reveal why he died, nor does the autopsy give any specific reason. The case ends up being thrown out because nobody was really particularly negligent here. And he just kind of died under mysterious circumstances. But what the judge just kind of says is, well, if the hospital or surgeon really wanted to, be wise and protect themselves, they probably should just get the most qualified people to be anesthetizing these patients, i.e., used an anesthesiologist, a physician to be doing this. And this is in the backdrop of provinces already making moves to regulate the practice of anesthesia. And ultimately, this case had a bit of a chilling effect where then nurse anesthesia just kind of gradually fizzled away. And that's the end of the story there, sort of. In 2009, University of Toronto tries to start a nurse practitioner and anesthesia program. It doesn't really go anywhere, just because there are no jobs for people. There are no pathways to employment after this. So it just kind of disappears as well. And of course, the story continues, particularly in British Columbia, where, kind of slowly, surely, and maybe not the most transparently, moves are being made to introduce the role of certified registered nurse anesthetists into at least that province. They've been talking about this for years. The plans are not particularly concrete so far as we know yet, and how it remains to be implemented, again, remains to be seen. Last month, the Canadian Anesthesiologist Society put out a pretty strong statement against CRNAs in Canada, and how exactly this will transpire, who knows? Now, it's just one of many challenges for peri-op care in Canada. And, you can think about the whole CRNA thing being part of a general trend towards more mid-level providers doing things that physicians previously did. Now, you think about, in primary care, nurse practitioners, physician assistants taking on a bigger role. Or running surgical or medical floors, for instance, or critical care units, doing more procedures. Where exactly this ends, who can say? And given all the issues in terms of human resourcing and physician resource planning, I would not be surprised to see, even in developed countries, more of a kind of task sharing, task shifting sort of phenomenon happening, as you see in variable resource countries, for instance. And so, one of the big challenges for our generation now is, there just aren't enough people to do things. And although people have sounded the alarm, specifically in anesthesia for decades about needing to train more anesthesiologists, for various reasons, policy failures, lack of cooperation between federal and provincial governments, hospitals, health authorities, universities, that problem had never really been satisfactorily addressed. And it's worse in some places than others. A significant minority of the country still lives in rural and remote communities, and yet, they're serviced by probably 1/10 of the amount of specialists that people in urban areas are. Huge disparities in the country. Now, in some jurisdictions, in Ontario, for instance, you do see a lot of family practice in the anesthesia, going on, particularly in community hospitals. Whereas it's mostly not present in places such as Nova Scotia. Is this part of the solution? It's probably not the be all and end all. I mean, God knows it's hard enough to find a family doctor as it is. And similarly, to divert nurses away from other critical roles. Don't get me started here on Western and the lack of nurses on the floor, peri-op nurses, PACU nurses. Over here, the PACU holds start at 9, and it's just cases being canceled left, right, and center. So the problem is there simply are not enough people to do things, and this counts for also like anesthesia assistants, for the people that work in SPD, biomed, porters. There just aren't enough people in general. So those are some of the big challenges. Now on this final slide, I think from the anesthesia perspective, we've had this model of the anesthesia care team where a physician, an anesthesiologist, is in lead of a team. In Canada, this would be a role such as anesthesia assistant or respiratory therapist. And this might be where things continue to head on. I think the platonic ideal of a one-to-one anesthesiologist and patient ratio is fantastic, but given current challenges, may not be sustainable, and we may see more team-based anesthesia over time. And although this is the Ether Day, grand rounds, we can see that anesthesia is so much more than just etherization and general anesthesia. As surgery becomes more complex, so develops subspecialty anesthesia of all sorts to better address some of these challenges that come up. And anesthesia has a role for the care of patients throughout their surgical perioperative journey. And really outside of the OR as well, from the cradle to the grave, literally, there's a role to be played. And finally, the very last point I want to make is that surgeons are having to do more with less. The cases are being canceled all the time. ORs are very restrictive. We're thinking more about having to do more cases under local or infiltration anesthesia, more things in the office or minors clinic. I just wanted to highlight some work being done locally. And I do see Dr. Walsh has raised his hand. I'll let Dr. Garza moderate here. But the very last thing I just wanted to mention, this is Don Lalonde out of DMNB. And he's been working for many years on, Willant approach to surgery, wide awake local anesthesia, no tourniquet. For hand and finger surgery, he's probably the most famous hand surgeon in North America. And this has garnered a lot of attention worldwide and has expanded in terms of its indications for things such as like distal radius fracture, foot and distal tibial fractures. I mentioned this both because it's some neat local content, but also it takes things back full circle of surgeons being interested in anesthesia and working to use it to best care for their patients. So thanks very much for tuning in, and very special thanks to Gord Lancelot for organizing the very first Ether Day Grand Rounds. And apologies for my loud cats in the background. I'll be happy to field any questions, including from Dr. Walsh and anybody else.